Zanan is now his PhD thesis, and the PhD thesis of Zanan is about the principle of equality, of modern equality, in Hegel, Marx, Heidegger, and Badiou. The title of the talk of Zanan is Hegel, Jacobi, Spinoza, and Equality, Jacobi's silent trace in Hegel's conception of concrete universality and the modern equality between equivalence and indifference. The title is already a talk, and so
thanks for this great organization. First of all, I wanted to say, after such an instructive and insightful and great lecture of Professor Zanan, it will be a modest trial to bring the same discussion to our present times, because I think that metaphysics is not a frozen thing, and because I believe that the task of philosophy is also to think its time, and I believe that this whole discussion has a relevance for our present times. The rise of far right is the biggest concern in Europe today. This collective mood of concern, however, is marked by something paradox. On the one hand, a discourse of fighting against the danger of far right seems to be going on with all mediatic and governmental means. Yet on the other hand, in face of its seemingly unstoppable rise, a constant being shocked is staged, as if the far right appeared out of the blue. This paradox should reveal the simple fact that there has perhaps never been a serious attempt to grasp the dynamics of this rise. Instead, in an ongoing journalistic atmosphere, self-evident opinions are asserted and stiffening the illusion, as if the reasons underlying this rise were not intrinsic to modern, thus capitalist and democratic principle itself, as if everything was fine in democratic capitalism besides a bunch of mad people disturbing the Occidental East. Perhaps it is a time to dare beholding that the dynamic which feeds the far right is not a local deviation from the arche of modern liberal democratic capitalism, yet its very unfoldment, if not its consummation. In order to make sense of that claim, let's take a somewhat consensual opinion on identitarianism. The journalistic narratives attribute the identitarian tendency of our times to a caricaturized image of a far-right personality embodying all the characteristics of the radical evil perfectly, like racism, sexism, conspiracism, anti-Semitism, so on and so forth. Such an image makes it quite easy for everyone to distance themselves and enjoy the relief of being part of the civic majority. Yet, to distort this simplistic narrative and break with its ideological frame, I would like to introduce a dialectical statement, which has a speculative purpose that I will unfold in the next 25 minutes. My statement is the following. The so-called late modern age, that is, our present times, is characterized by a longing for difference rather than for identity. Or to put it more accurately, today, longing for identity expresses itself as a longing for difference. Take the following quote from a speech that Giorgia Meloni addressed to the so-called World Congress of Families in 2019 as a significant symptom. Quote, "I must not be able to call myself Italian, Christian, woman, mother. No, I must be citizen X, gender X, parent 1, parent 2. I must be a number, because when I'm just a number, when I have no identity, when I have no roots, then I will be the perfect slave at the mercy of big financial speculators, the perfect consumer," unquote. I can imagine that it might be a little surprising, if not irritating, to begin a talk on Hegel, Spinoza, and modern equality with Meloni, and you may ask yourself, what's at stake here? Well, please note that Meloni's speech has been circulating in different countries all over the world, and not exclusively among far-right groups, but also among so-called civic middle-class people. So I claim that there is a potential which this reaction can entail in symptomatic character for thinking our time, that is, thinking what is today. In order to unfold this potential, let's take the symptom serious and ask, what could be the enticing moment in Meloni's speech? I don't think that the answer lies in the longing for identity in its abundance, yet rather in a fear of a decay into indifference, as the contrasting examples show, that is, becoming a citizen X, a number, or a mere consumer. In other words, the determining moment seems to be not the aspiration for a superior dominating identity in its abundance, like being Italian, Christian, Aryan, etc., as we know it from the classical fascistic aspiration, yet any difference, qua-difference, which can save one from indifference. This is a concern today shared in some way or another by every late modern individual, no matter from which front of worldview. Insofar as one can see a longing for identity as the flip side of a longing for difference, the dialectic between identity and difference is surely not a peculiarity of our present. Yet, changing the perspective from identity to difference is not an empty sophistry. For in all its dialectically belonging together, the moment that has a primacy is the difference today. Insofar as the longing for difference can be seen as the general symptom of a discontent with modern equality from all sides. Why discontent? For modern equality is not a flat sameness. It is based on a promise of the unity of two extreme opposites, a right to difference, which is bound at the same time by a ban of transcendence, which is to say that no subjective difference must truly dominate any other. Well, this opposition entails huge potential for tension. For on the one hand, we live in a society in which an advertisement slogan like "make a difference" has long become an imperative. This is to say that the criterion of success today lies nowhere else than in the question whether one's own difference can be distinguished in any realm as unique or not. Yet on the other hand, one must constantly face the fact that this imperative is impossible to fulfill, as every subjective difference claiming to be unique circulates as an equivalent offer among equally valid legal persons. So, put dialectically, longing for difference is paradoxically the moment which throws every individual back to being common, just like anyone else. In light of all these symptoms, I argue that for the first time today, it is possible to conceptualize the principle of modern equality in its full tension of opposing moments. And I claim to achieve this within one single word, and that word is Gleichgültigkeit. Well, as you all know, the German language is a goldmine in its ability to carry opposites into unity. This is indeed what Hegel remarks in Logic when he says, quote, "The German language has many advantages over other modern languages. For many of its words have the further peculiarity of carrying not just different meanings, but opposite ones. And in this, one cannot fail to recognize the language's speculative spirit. It can delight thought to come across such words and to discover in naive form already in the lexicon as one word of opposite meanings, that union of opposites, which is the result of speculation," unquote. So in guise of that remark and the symptoms of our confused world, I would like to state the following thesis. Modern equality is a specific logic of difference, and Gleichgültigkeit is its principle. Consisting of the adjective gleich, meaning equal, and the noun Gültigkeit, meaning validity, Gleichgültigkeit means in German, in its daily use, merely indifference. Yet, taken in the original sense of the words that it consists of, the same word can also mean equivalence. So there lies a potential of a movement within the meaning spectrum of this word, which we can formulate in the following way. Equivalence may shift to indifference. The speculative potential lies here in the following question. If modern equality oscillates differences between equivalence and indifference, and thus the principle of modern liberal democratic capitalist equality can be determined as Gleichgültigkeit in its double sense, can we think political equality without Gleichgültigkeit? Before going further, let us clarify. How do I come up with such a claim that modern equality is a specific logic of difference? To give a concise answer to this, let me shortly turn to Aristotle. We can derive three categories of equality from three different words to which Aristotle refers in Nicomachean Ethics. Sameness from homoiosis in the sense of similarity, arithmetical equality from isotes, like when I say 2 + 2 = 4, and commensurability from symmetria. This last one is decisive for the development of the modern equality as a logic of difference, and thus for understanding its principle as Gleichgültigkeit in its double sense. Why is it decisive for modernity? Commensurability is simply the idea of equality of unequals in regard to something external to them. In other words, it is the equalization of unequals, that is, differences, through mediation of a third term. To comprehend it, let us take a basic example from Nicomachean Ethics. There, Aristotle states that not two doctors, but a doctor and a peasant can build a community. Why? For building a community necessitates unequals, that is, difference. It is the community which first established their equality. This Aristotelian determination is, for example, what Hannah Arendt sticks to when she emphasizes the political character of equality, which in her account cannot be based on sameness, but on plurality, thus on difference. However, a problem which Aristotle has never dealt with, and which Arendt also has dismissed, consists in the following question. How to think or apply such a form of equality which should be based on the equality of differences universally? That is, without binding it to and limiting it with any subset, be it certain state, class, race, or gender. As striking as it may sound, it was Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi who played a key role, malgré soi, in solving this problem. Without ever realizing it, Jacobi has not only contributed to the development of the concept of modern equality in the form that we know it today, but he also anticipated its pitfalls. In Letters to Mendelssohn, he already gives the core idea of what Hegel later called concrete universality in its most abstract form. Let me open it up. Jacobi claims a logic of commensurability in Spinoza's thought from the very outset, rendering everything different, or every different thing, if you like, to equalize concepts through the mediation of reason, which he described later as a creation, or quote, out of nothing to nothing, in nothing, for nothing, unquote. For Jacobi, an abstract human as mediated by reason cannot differentiate herself from any other human. For according to Jacobi, if I count as human and she counts as human, then we count as one and the same void being of reason. What he has seen in Spinoza was nothing but the void reason. He had in fact no political stake whatsoever. His point of objection was quite religious. And as for religion, I think that we can regard Jacobi himself as one of the most curious symptoms of the death of God. Curious, for Jacobi has been suffering this death way before it had been declared by Nietzsche. Perhaps it was a projection that Jacobi saw in most of his contemporaries, nothing but an oblivion of God, for he himself sensed the death of God already and reacted to this death with all his force. In that regard, perhaps it is again symptomatic that it was not the speculative thinkers like Fichte, whom Jacobi accused of being nihilists, yet Jacobi himself who had to fight his own void. Please note this quite interesting passage from Jacobi's letters. Quote, I need a truth, which is not my product, but a truth whose product I am, a truth which could fill my void, unquote. Well, perhaps it's a sublime moment of anti-philosophy which we can behold here. For seen from the perspective of the anti-philosopher, the philosopher never confronts her own void. The anti-philosopher is in contrast to one who personalizes the question of truth and can confront her own void. It is perhaps this anti-philosophical urge, a strange gift of insight, which led Jacobi to anticipate a possible shift from equivalence to indifference in the primacy of abstract reason. He anticipated that way before such a shift became palpable in the further unfoldment of modernity. Yet, why did Jacobi project all this on Spinoza's thought? One can certainly say that in Jacobi's account, it was the idea of the system, that is an aspiration to a unity in which the universal should be accessible within each particularity. Jacobi was convinced that such a system must put God into oblivion and ended up in nihilism. Why? For to bring forth such a unity, one needs first to deprive God of its ontological privilege. Once deprived of the concrete theological one, an abstract epistemological unity becomes possible. So, according to Jacobi, only in this way could one dissolve incommensurable objects of recognition into pure constructs of reason. So, in a way, dissolve the heterogeneity of differences. Only in this way could they become equivalent. Yet, such an equivalence meant for Jacobi merely indifference. So he held Spinoza's system for the dissolution of any true individuality responsible, insofar as there is nothing which could differentiate two products of the reason from each other. Thus, let me sum up Jacobi's position in the following concise way in German. Wenn alles gleiche Gültigkeit hat, dann wird alles gleichgültig. I think that the presence of both Jacobi and Spinoza is most decisive in Hegel, not where he refers directly to Jacobi or Spinoza, as for example in Jena writings, but rather where neither of them is mentioned, like in his philosophy of right. Let me unfold. There is a striking irony in Hegel's relation to Jacobi on Spinoza. Hegel affirms the frame of Jacobi's Spinoza reading silently in defending reason. This means literally, Hegel affirms Jacobi's own frame by defending Spinoza against Jacobi. How does it occur? Well, unlike Jacobi's reconstruction of Spinozism, Hegel maintains that universality does not have to dissolve individuality into indifference, but can be conceived concretely on the very same basis of the mediation of reason. For in Hegel's account, humans with reason can distinguish themselves from everything else and also from other humans, as the universal exists for them. So, our particularity of being human is a mediation of the universal with itself, such that in that mediation, the particular and the universal can be thought of as identical. If we take an animal, even if it's in itself universal, Hegel says, the universal does not exist for it. So an animal is only the individual thing that it does. Yet, concrete universality means for Hegel that we always know that we are humans, no matter who else we are or what we do. It means that the process of particularizing for humans is the universal factor itself, such that humans can particularize themselves, and in that particularization, the universal remains in unclouded clarity with itself. This is what Hegel calls the true meaning of the universal, quote, which cost millennia before entering into human consciousness, unquote. So in contrast to antiquity, where only certain particular humans counted as human, in modernity, a human counts as such, quote, because she's a human being, not because she's Greek, Jew, Catholic, Protestant, German, Italian, etc., unquote. What we must see in the idea of concrete universality is itself ambivalent, for it is both the basis of the later modern liberal capitalist reconciliation between difference and equality, and also the source of any modern idea of emancipation, which claimed to go beyond capitalism. For after this idea, it becomes possible to think differences between humans without political hierarchies that go with them, such that differences can now be conceived as equally valid, that is, gleichgültig. This comes to an ultimately clear expression in philosophy of right, where Hegel affirms that, quote, the right of the subject's particularity to find satisfaction at its personal extremes without necessarily having to be in conflict with the substantial unity of the universal is the pivotal and focal point in the difference between antiquity and the modern age. What we need to focus on in this determination is that Hegel's thought of concrete universality responds to Jacobi and shows a certain immunity against his accusation of lack of individuality in the so-called Spinoza's void reason in the speculative thinkers of the time. So what we see here is a perfect application of what Hegel thinks is lacking in Spinoza when he says that his substance is not yet a subject. In other words, his concrete universality applied in philosophy of right is precisely Hegel's substance as subject in actu. Yet, what Hegel silently affirms here is a fundamental assumption, which is that there is a primacy of substance in Spinoza over attributes, as if there will already be a substance as totality over there, which just could not find itself and consumes itself in its attributes. This is clearly Jacobi's assumption, which Hegel just takes over. Yet such a totality cannot be thought without a mediating instance, that is, an instance which carries the unity of the individual and the universal. Jacobi Spinoza helps Hegel here on the one hand to give a modern basis to the old Aristotelian principle of symmetria, on which he could universalize the thought of equality of the unequal. Yet, paradoxically, through this move, he distances himself from Spinoza, and we miss the speculative chance to think equality without mediation, and thus without the filtering of capital for almost 200 years. I mean, until centuries later, thinkers like Pierre Macherey and Alain Badiou offered some insights on a possible thought of equality quite in the spirit of Spinoza. But this is just a detail en passant that I cannot open up here further. We find expression of Hegel's solution in his determination of the civil society as a system of needs, in which every person is a legal person having equal validity, and everyone serves to everyone else and receives service from others at the same time. The instance which carries the unity and the equivalence of differences on the basis of being equally valid legal persons is called Sittlichkeit. In other words, in a system of needs, ethical life mediates every subjective difference and keep them equivalent without any oppression. Well, as we all know here, the reality of the unfoldment of modernity has been just a little bit different. This is also historically Marx's point of intervention. Marx shows us the idea of concrete universality in Hegel, which is ideally renders every subjective difference equivalent on the basis of a supposed Sittlichkeit, is grounded in reality in a shift in the conception of the labor form which could mediate subjective differences. What kind of shift? Well, in Capital, it strikes Marx that classical political economy elevates living labor, flüssige Arbeit, to a measure of exchange value and regards it merely as labor time, that is, as quantity. Yet when it comes to what living labor objectifies, political economists of the time treat the objectified labor again qualitatively, namely as its use value. Marx here deciphers a blind metaphysical assumption which points towards a latent shift in the conception of abstract human labor form from quality to quantity. For a quantitative conception of labor as labor time presupposes a qualitative unity of human labor form. This exploration is in fact based on nothing else than Hegel's definition of the shift from quality to quantity in logic. We should note how Hegel determines quantity, namely as quality which became gleichgültig. So again, we find the relevance of the double meaning of Gleichgültigkeit here in case of the shift of abstract labor from quality to quantity, which we can grasp as both becoming equivalent and indifferent at the same time, which finds a political expression in modernity. It is this political expression which in fact allows Marx to read out the secret source of commensurability in the commodity form itself, that is, in abstract human labor. Consider the following passage in Capital, quote, "The secret of the expression of value, the equality and equal validity," and he uses here the word gleiche Gültigkeit, "of all labor, because and insofar as it is human labor in general, can be deciphered only once the concept of human equality already has the firmness of a popular judgment. But this is possible in a society in which the commodity form is the general form of the labor product, thus also the relationship of people to each other as commodity owners is the dominant social relationship. We should not forget that capital is nothing else than a specific mediation of human labor with itself. So in Hegel's sense, a concrete universality, yet in the most abstract form. In that regard, we can reveal the labor form again as gleichgültig in the double sense, as the condition of possibility for Hegel's system of needs to exist. This is for Marx the main source of tension in the principle of modern equality, which by equalizing human labor does not emancipate humans, but instead indifferentiates inequalities among them, which comes nowhere more clearly to expression than in the Communist Manifesto. So let me refer here to a famous passage. Quote, "The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers." So when Marx attributes a certain civilizing effect to capital, it is not on the basis of a truly emancipatory potential. Equivalence of human labor dissolves the previous transcending hierarchies, it is true. Yet, this equalizing dissolution alone cannot be considered emancipatory, for it does not realize equality, but just dissolves every hitherto transcending difference into indifference, by shifting previous political inequalities of pre-modern times into the private and the social spheres, and shifting what Marx called the real duality of the medieval age to the abstract duality in modernity. Heading to the conclusion, let me ask, can we say that Jacobi was right? Was modern equality predestined to shift equivalence of subjective differences to indifference? If we follow Marx, perhaps. However, we must note here that Marx followed the same logic of mediation. So in a way, he also affirmed Jacobi's frame. Can we say then that Jacobi had a self-fulfilling prophecy? Perhaps, for he was right, quite right in his anticipation, only that he was wrong in attributing it to Spinoza. I mean, wrong in attributing a logic of mediation to him, which presupposes a substance from which attributes should have been derived. What Hegel affirmed was exactly this reading, which he perfected, and which opened the way for a notion like the right to difference that could be taken for granted in the later democratic discourse, yet a right with which nobody today seems to be content. Let me conclude by referring shortly to Pierre Macharet. For I think that what Macharet shows us implicitly is a possibility of reading Spinoza which goes beyond any logic of mediation and reconciliation. For Macharet remarks that in Spinoza there is no hierarchy between attributes and substance whatsoever. This can help us rethink concrete universality instead of dismissing it. For concrete universality is a noble idea, yet resorted to capital, it is obvious that it fails. In face of various reactions which point out an exhaustion of the conception of an equality based on mediation through capital, the time has come in which we can dare to raise the thought of equality to another stage without losing Hegel's vigor, by freeing ourselves from Jacobi's frame. For if there is no primacy of substance, then it means that there is the speculative possibility to think equality absolute without equivalence and indifference. Thus, to think Gleichheit without Gleichgültigkeit. Thinking this possibility opens up a new trajectory for speculative thought in our present times to follow, and I would say a quite novel one, for inventing a new egalitarian maxim. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We have 10 minutes for discussion, a little bit more, perhaps. Zdravko. Professor Kolbe. Sorry.
Thank you for your speech. I won't go into the details of the various persons named. I was just sum it up. You make a difference between abstract universal and concrete universal applied to the field of the politics and emancipation. And then you refer to Hegel and his theory of civil society. As I don't know now, good or bad example, of course. And you connect it with the ethical life, Sittlichkeit. However, you should know that in Hegel, this is unsittliche Sittlichkeit. Das ist Zerfall des Sittlichen. So if you talk about civil society within Hegel, then this is always a middle stage, middle form that presupposes for its existence and functioning something else. And in this very point, Hegel would speak about abstract universal. So where is the place for the concrete universal in Hegel's system? But it's obvious, in the state. So if you talk about it, you should consider this relation between the conception of individual in the civil society, but framed within the state. And there in the state, there are a lot of different institutions already mediated at the level of civil society, but especially a political mediation that then you should, I think, brought into your consideration. I would just say that Hegel had a very different idea of representation than nowadays, where the representant do not stand for, but are the society in the small, and so on. I would speak more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Zdravko, for this notice, and I will think about the Unsittlichkeit der Sittlichkeit selbst. This is an interesting note, and also that the role of the state is lacking. But I will still hold on the idea that what we should think, what is lacking today is that there is a kind of taken for granted conception of modern equality. And I think that the moment that I would like to underlie, or what I tried to underline, was that the possibility to think differences without political hierarchies is something which we owe in a way also to Hegel. And I would say, rather than state, it's another discussion, but he traces it back to Christianity. But I would still say that if we just take it politically, we cannot just do without the mediator role of the state. I agree with you. But thanks for your notices.
Thank you so much, Stephen Allgate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got a question about the remark you made at the end, equality without equivalence. And I wanted to know if you mean equality without any equivalence at all, or equality without reduction to equivalence. Because it seems to me there is a difference there, and we can see that between Marx and Hegel. I think you're right that Marx is, in a sense, getting rid of equivalence, and the whole point of getting rid of exchange value, and getting rid of value at all, is to get rid of the quantitative equivalence between individuals and, if you like, to liberate particularity. Hegel, it seems to me, doesn't want to get rid of equivalence. He wants to retain equivalence, but no longer have it as something to which we are reduced. And now, there's one thing you didn't really speak about, unless I missed it, And that is the connection between Gleichgültigkeit and quantity. And it seems to me that quantity is crucial in all of this. And one could argue that Hegel retains the idea that in some sense we remain, and we must remain, in a relation of quantitative equivalence to one another, but not be reduced to that. Whereas Marx seems to want to eliminate that strand. And it's a simple question, where do you stand on this? Do you want to get rid of equivalence, which is what you sounded like you wanted to do, or do you want to retain it without reducing us to it? And could you say a bit about that and what the implications are?
Oh yeah, thanks for the question. I actually referred here without giving any names to the contemporary possibilities of speculative thinking of equality. I mean, I refer neither to Marx nor Hegel, but more a kind of Spinoza's motive, which I would argue that there is in Badiou's Immanence of Truth, is his last book, is a possibility of thinking equality as affirming infinity. He says that like it is a, okay, in his language, I would probably imagine that Zdravko would not like it, but it's a kind of eventual possibility to affirm infinity, and infinity is always an infinite equality and form of equality which is incommensurable. But this is not something which we can just take as a part of the given everyday relations, I would say. That's a speculative possibility to think equality otherwise in a Spinoza's spirit, I would say.
Just briefly, you haven't really addressed the question of quantity.
Oh,
because,
sorry.
Because I mean, if you take the logic, then, and we think of the categories as being necessary determinations of being, then quality is necessary, quantity is necessary, and of course, as Marx well knew, quantity generates quality in measure. And ontologically, quantity is irreducible. Now that surely would have a relevance in the philosophy of right, that quantitative equivalences cannot be eliminated from the economy. And so the idea of an equality without equivalence would seem to be ontologically impossible. And the Hegelian suggestion, I think, is to retain that quantitative equivalence between people, retain exchange value, even giving an exchange value to labor power, but not reducing people to that, because you have to allow particularity to develop. And I'm still not quite sure where you stand on this. If you actually want to get rid of that quantitative equivalence, in which case, what do you do with the section on quantity in the logic? Does that have to go at the ontological level? Or do you want to keep it, but just not have us reduced to it, which is what I kind of hope.
Well, I would argue that the way how you talk about equality is just presupposing the logic of equivalence in such a way that it becomes impossible to think the speculative potential. Like you just presume, okay, equivalence is here, we cannot do without it, so how can we think that which goes beyond that? But what I try to argue is a speculative possibility just does not assume, it is something which can be thought in infinity and not in the quantitative way. Of course, Marx knew that we needed a form of quantitative equivalence, and it was the way he could think. Like that's a really important moment, that he could think that only on the basis that human labor could be thought as a form of quantity, that was the basis of modern equality. But what I tried to show, that our time just shows us that we need, I don't know, I also don't have the answer like an open book, but I think that we try to go over a logic of equality which is based on equivalence. And what I only just said was, there is, in my opinion, Quentin Meillassoux, Alain Badiou, Pierre Macheret, they offer some insights on how to think such a possibility today. I know that maybe it was not an answer to your question.
Thank you so much. The last one, very quickly, Bojana.
So thank you so much for your talk. Now, one link I've missed, maybe it was implicit there, but I think it's definitely important, is the connection between Gleichgültigkeit and mechanism. We know that at least in the context of Hegel and Hegel's philosophy of right, especially his system of needs, he sees a positive correlation between the two. So mechanism is not that something artificial that differentiates and limits one individual from the other, but on the contrary, something by virtue of which, at least again, in the section of civil society, system of needs, facilitates the individual to realize his or her own needs. So if you maybe just tell me, how do you understand this relation between Gleichgültigkeit and mechanism in this context? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm not sure if I could follow the link, and that's why I probably maybe we should talk in in the break so that I could understand a little bit more, and we can talk about after, so that I don't steal the time of people, but I don't have any quick answer to give to this in a second. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.